Dr. Hearn, opening school update.
Yes, thank you. As things are changing so rapidly, I was going to do an oral update to you this evening and then follow up with the community in written form later this week. I know people are interested in knowing what's happening on a local level with respect to opening schools. I first want to acknowledge that we are kind of understandably aware that this is a time of a lot of anxiety. People want to know what's going to happen. There's a lot of fear. And we see that certainly among families who've been reaching out. We know that students are experiencing that and our staff as well. So I want to make sure that we're responsive to that, acknowledging and validating it. And providing information as we are able, even if it does change, acknowledging that it may change, just giving people the information of what we know. It is still somewhat of a fluid situation. It has been kind of this whole time. There has been a couple of different updates on information, and what's driving all of the guidance is really health statistics in the state of Massachusetts and what's happening as the phased reopening continues forward. So I don't have all of the answers, and there may be more questions that I'm able to answer at this time, but I'll share with you what I know, and it may be subject to change. So we received initial guidance from the Department of Ed on June 25th, and last week there was a first set of updates related to special education, and on July 9th, special education guidance was released, and then an updated guidance document and frequently asked questions were released on July 10th. We understand that the Department of Ed will also be updating their guidance from the initial form in the midsummer timeframe. One of the things that the guidance on Friday kind of cautioned against is making a decision too early. And so we've been asked to hold off on having any decision about what the fall will look like until early August. Again, really in response to health and safety as the weeks unfold. So at this time, we're working to develop a plan. It's really one plan to address health and safety requirements as well as different student learning models. We're being asked to plan for in-person instruction, hybrid instruction, which would be part in school and part remote, and then fully remote learning model for next year. And the Department of Education has asked that we submit our plan by July 31st. So I would expect at the next school committee meeting, which is on the 28th, to have much more concrete information for you in advance of the 31st. A template is to be issued this week from the department that we would fill out for the plan. And the final guidance will be coming out from the department somewhere around the time frame when that plan is being submitted. Right now, we are planning through our reopening task force over the next couple of weeks, convening working groups to work on teaching and learning as well as digital learning, to work on matters related to personnel, to work on whole child supports or social emotional learning, and then of course to also address the health and safety requirements and kind of operations of schools, including some of our routines, transportation, food services, and the like. As I had mentioned previously, it's a pretty large group. It's growing too. We probably have close to 60 people who are collaborating. It includes administrators, teachers and counselors, union reps, community reps such as the school resource officer, as well as the town's Department of Health lead, Kathleen Liberty. We are confirming parent and guardian involvement this week, asking principals to help connect us with some people from their school councils who are elected through the schools for governance matters. And we will seek student input as our planning shapes up. We surveyed the community, and that survey closed yesterday, so it would be premature to release any information. But it was two parts. We wanted to reflect on remote learning and gather feedback from families and staff about remote learning, using that input to improve the expectations for any remote learning model next year. Recognizes that it needs to be more robust. We also, as we think about the future, wanted to seek and understand the needs of our community members. So from our faculty, we wanted to gain a sense of how many may have medical concerns that would preclude any in-person attendance. And from our families, any medical concerns for students or family members that might mean that the child's too at risk to attend school in person. Or conversely, community members who are essential workers or who have job requirements that would necessitate additional support, including in-person or extended solutions childcare. We are also trying to assess our transportation needs and the wishes of the community with respect to busing. That is going to be one of the more complicated operational pieces to opening school with physical distancing on buses. So we were trying to gain a sense of who might sign up for busing in advance of sending out any formal registration form. So we have some information there. And while it may seem redundant, I think as plans shape up and we are able to provide the community with a little bit more certainty, I think we will need to issue additional surveys to understand how family needs may be changing and shifting because their workplace requirements may change and shift. And so, and same with our faculty in terms of the school districts that their children perhaps may attend. So we will continue to kind of seek that two-way communication as part of the planning process. And although this last survey was open for a week, I don't anticipate having that much time for future surveys. I think they'll have to be quicker with faster turnaround. And the communication will have to get a bit more concrete between families and schools and our staff and HR department. We're also really pretty excited I am anyway, and I think a number of people in the office are as well, but we've been implementing the mandatory workplace safety standards in order to open up our school offices and central office this summer. That includes physical distancing expectations, hygiene protocols, training, as well as about regular staffing and operations, about behavior within the office space, cleaning and disinfecting protocols, and then isolation and contact tracing. So it gives us an opportunity to kind of put in place some of the practices that would need to be expanded upon in the school setting. And so we have been bringing our staff members into those training sessions, and people have been coming into central office on a rotating basis, and we do have some office staff working in our schools. The offices continue to be closed to the public at this time, however, as we get our safety practices underway. And we anticipate with the clearance from the Department of Public Health that once our practices are operationalized and if the health data continues to be favorable, we can open initially probably by appointment. Many of our staff, though, is continuing to work remotely where possible, and we've gotten, I think, pretty effective at it. But we will adjust based on guidance from the state and in consultation with our Board of Health. And it is such a relief, actually, to be in the office and to see a few folks, in person and face to face. And so we will be doing more of that in the coming weeks. As a matter of preparation, we're following the department's guidance with respect to PPE or personal protective equipment. And so utilizing the funding that came in from the CARES Act to order disposable masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer for classrooms for our staff, some more specialized PPE for our nurses, and looking to be able to respond to the department's expectations and requirements for PPE being worn. And in the initial guidance, the requirement is students in grades 2 and up, with kindergarten and first grade being more of a local decision and encouraged by the department. And then all adults wearing masks unless there's a medical exemption that needs to be afforded. DESE has asked us to do a stress or feasibility test of our physical space. And so we took a look at our physical space to see how desks might fit in classrooms under 3 feet of distancing, if that were to be the requirement. There is also certainly consideration, as you know, being discussed where 6 feet of physical distancing has been the typical standard. So we're looking at our physical space. We are considering alternative locations for classes should that be needed, for example, in the auditorium and spacing out large classrooms in the cafeteria, auditorium, or lecture hall if needed. And so we're kind of in the initial stages of that. It's a collaborative effort. We're going to need to work with our health agent and Franklin Fire Department as well on some of those physical pieces. We are also, as I said, looking at the hybrid model or remote for part in-school learning and part remote learning. So those are being actively worked on by working groups in advance of that July 31st date. We have not determined from a hybrid perspective what the best model would be to break students up into cohort groups where some are in attendance and some are remote and then they switch. So we're looking at that. A big factor there is the cleaning protocols and how much time it would require and take to clean, particularly the high school. The high school is a really big facility and has a lot of square feet. So that cannot be done quickly. So I would rule out any morning session, afternoon session, because I just don't think we would have enough time to clean and disinfect the building if that were to be the model. Mm-hmm. There were a few questions that a few people asked over the course of the week from the school committee after I sent out, over the course of the past couple weeks, since I sent the initial guidance your way. So I'm happy to address some of those. There was information in the guidance related to a level service budget plus. And so what did the commissioner mean with respect to finances there? And what this means is providing financial support on top of the district's projected budget. Although he recognizes in the frequently asked questions document that he came out with, the legislature is still developing FY21. But I think what he was pointing to is that the governor made money available in 2 forms of grants. One is a per pupil expense grant where we will have some additional money to support things that are needed for going back to school. And the other is a grant related to technology and being able to provide more technology in a matching system where they would match a percentage based on our Chapter 70 the percent that they contribute to Chapter 70, they would match to support some technology needs. So we're keeping attuned to those. Miriam has been attending some Department of Ed webinars and understanding the application requirements for those. But basically it was a recognition that more support would be needed from the state compared to what came in from the federal government through the CARES funding initially a couple months ago. I talked already a little bit about the cohorts and the hybrid model. We are thinking about ways in which to limit the group interactions over the course of the day and the number of adults that are working with groups of students and the interactions that adults might have. We typically do have multiple adults in one classroom at times. So there are some things to plan for that. There was some reference in the Department of Ed's guidance to space in the community, and could community space be used in order to instruct students? And just by way of example, in other communities, for example, the Boys and Girls Club has come forward and offered spaces to school districts to hold school. I'm not sure that we will be seeking community spaces. I think our high school is a challenge with respect to the number of students in our high school building, in terms of having about 1,750 students. But with our capacity study being done by the architects, we do have a decreased enrollment, K-8. We do have, I think, a little bit of space that could be utilized in our K-8 buildings pretty effectively, but our concern would really be around staffing. In terms of physical coverage of staffing, if we spread students out, which I've mentioned here before. One question that is coming up a lot is around the ability for families to homeschool their children instead of sending their students to the Franklin Public Schools. So I wanted to be sure to make a distinction between remote learning and homeschool. And homeschool has been in place for quite some time as an alternative choice that families can exercise that would actually unenroll their child from the local school district, and the family takes responsibility for the child's education. There is a process by which the family applies, and Dr. Edwards, as the Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning, reviews homeschool plans. The family takes the responsibility for curriculum, instruction, assessment, and materials, and has to seek approval. Dr. Edwards reviews that to make sure that the plan that the family has put forward is comparable in breadth and depth of a typical curriculum, but they do not need to follow the state frameworks, and they could actually teach, make different choices. It just has to be comparable. So it's a very independent, approach. We recognize that there are some families who may need to, for medical reasons, opt into a fully remote environment. And state guidance has discussed how families should make this choice in consultation with medical providers, and that we will need to consider this as it relates to our attendance policies. So remote learning or going fully remote may be an option, but it is distinct from homeschool, where remote learning would be under the responsibility of Franklin Public Schools. And I expect more clarity to come later about that. So that's a bit of our update. We are very actively planning and working towards having an initial plan. It will not be the final plan July 31st, but an initial plan for July 31st to submit to the state. And I think you can expect another update at the July 28th meeting. Happy to answer any questions. I'm sure there's a ton.
Any questions from the group? Questions from the committee? Sarah, I just had one quick question, and I know this would be part of what you're considering. I just was in the event, let's say they were saying that possibly things could get worse with the sort of in Massachusetts or any of the states, given the flu season and things getting worse. Is there a line drawn that where it would automatically shift back to remote learning? Is that something that's being considered? I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I think that that's something that we need to be prepared for. And part of the ultimate plan will include kind of the criteria that we will use in making decisions about whether or not to go back to remote learning fully, and how that will be communicated. So that would be part of, part of the more comprehensive plan, not the July 31st plan, I don't think, but a more comprehensive plan before school opens. Yeah.
And I just had one other quick question about the use of the building. I know over the summer, families register new students, you know, to
Mhm.
come into the, is that something they would do by appointment, to go to central office? Where do they go if they want to register, right now for, you know?
So we have built an online registration system, and the
Okay,
link is on our website.
very
So
good.
we did that as part of the remote process. It's also a way to change addresses. So if there's been a change in address, that form it's a combined form and can be completed. And it initially goes to our assistants in the central office, and then there is a follow-up piece at the school level with school-based secretaries for further information. But a lot of that can now be done online. There may be a need for in-person registration later in the summer, and we can communicate out about when we're ready for that. But at this point, we are registering and
Okay,
welcome new students and new families through the online system.
good.
And if
Any other?
anybody's having trouble with that, just make a phone call to the superintendent's office, and we can also talk people through by the phone.
Excellent, good. Any other questions, committee? Okay.
And I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Elise, sorry.
That's okay. Sarah, I'm just wondering if with the task force of 60 people, definitely a huge group, but obviously you need people that are expert in so many different areas. That's so important because you have the subcommittees. I'm wondering if they're, you know, sort of piggybacking off of what you did in the superintendent's conference today with Jessica Manahan and the SEL and trauma piece as far as the counselors. So are there counselors as part of that task force and sort of representing each grade level? Because I think school adjustment or social emotional concerns or questions are so different high school than they are in preschool or kindergarten. Are there counselors? You had said teachers and counselors, and so I didn't know if that meant teachers at each level, counselors at each level, or if it's, you know, I guess I'm just sort of curious about the roles of the people.
Yeah, so we tried to do teachers and counselors from different levels. We don't have one from each level from a counseling perspective, but we do have an elementary counselor and a secondary school psychologist. But each building principal is also developing their own team for school-wide implementation and bringing communication to and from the larger group to be thinking about school-based implementation. So there is a lot of involvement, I think, across the district from various groups by different levels involving educators and counselors.
Gotcha. So so then the principals are on the big task force?
The principals and assistant principals are as well, all of whom have previous experience in the classroom or as counselors or special educators themselves.
Okay, gotcha. And then a question for you, and then I guess through the chair to the rest of the school committee, have you considered if there's a role for school committee members? I know we're all have so much free time in our lives trying to do another committee, but just sort of wondering your thoughts on having school committee representation on the task force.
Yeah, so I would welcome school committee representation on the task force. I think initially when this was being sort of communicated and developed, we were getting the sense that it was going to be more dictated at the state level and wasn't quite sure how much local discretion we were going to be able to have, but that seems to be shifting a bit. And I think that's part of how Massachusetts is set up from a governance standpoint. And as you get into more and more of the details, I mentioned earlier, for example, the attendance policy, you know, there's a lot from a policy standpoint that is within your purview. There's going to be handbook changes, for example. Judy brought up transportation and cleaning and disinfecting of the buses. So there is quite a bit at the local level that we are in a position of responding to kind of statewide expectations, but there is more work, I think, locally than perhaps was initially sort of being communicated or thought about. So I would welcome a school committee school committee representation on the committee.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I mean, that's certainly whatever people want. I mean, certainly, I know one of the reasons we initially said we maybe didn't need it was because Sarah was going to be providing full updates to the committee frequently. But I certainly would welcome if someone would want to represent the school committee. If you'd let me know, that would be great. You could let me know, and then that would be through me to appoint. So if you're interested, just please send me an email, and I will certainly follow through. Sound okay?
Yep. Thanks, Anne.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay. I guess anything else, school committee at all? Any other questions, comments? Okay.